She was an Irish cook, and her name was Mary Milan, and she was the first person ever identified being a carrier of the typhoid outbreak. The media dubbed her Typhoid Mary, and her trial and forced quarantine captured all sorts of public attention at the time. A gentleman named George Soper was not your typical detective. He was a civil engineer by training and had become something of an expert in sanitation. So when in 1906 a landlord in Long Island was struggling to trace the source of a typhoid outbreak, Soper was called in. The landlord had rented out his Long Island house to a banker's family and their servants for the summer. By late August, 6 of the 11 in the household had fallen ill with typhoid fever. Soper had previously been hired by New York State to investigate disease outbreaks. He was called an epidemic fighter, and he believed that typhoid could be spread by one person serving as a carrier. In Long Island, he focused attention on the cook, Mary Milan, who had arrived 3 weeks before the first person became ill. What Soper discovered would demonstrate how an unwitting carrier could be the root of disease outbreaks, and later spark a debate about personal autonomy when it's pitted against public health. Combing through the roster of wealthy New Yorkers who had employed Mary in their summer homes between 1900 and 1907, he found a trail of 22 infected people. Typhoid fever is a bacterial infection typically spread through water and water contaminated by salmonella. Patients fall ill with high fever, diarrhea, and before antibiotics were developed to treat it, sometimes delirium and death. At that time, without regulated sanitation practices in place, the disease was fairly common, and New York had battled multiple outbreaks. In 1906, the year that Soper began his investigation, a reported 639 people had died of typhoid in New York, but never had an outbreak been traced to a single carrier, and certainly not one without any symptoms themselves. Soper learned that Mary would often serve ice cream and fresh peaches on Sunday. Compared to her hot cooked meals, he deduced that there was no better way to be found for a cook to cover her hands of microbes and infect a family. Mary was quarantined with other inmates for more than a third of her life. It's likely she never fully understood how typhoid spread. On 2 separate outbreaks, she is estimated to have infected 51 people, 3 of whom died. 4 months after he started the investigation, Soper found Mary working in a Park Avenue brownstone house. 37-year-old Irish cook. He later described was 5 foot 6 inches tall, a blonde with clear blue eyes, healthy color, and somewhat determined mouth and jaw. When confronted with his evidence and a request for a urine and feces samples, she surged at Soper with a carving knife. Dr. S. Josephine Baker, an up-and-coming advocate of hygiene and public health, was dispatched to convince Mary to provide samples, but was also chased away. Baker, whose father had died of typhoid, later made it her mission to promote preventative medicine and became the first woman to earn a doctorate in public health. It was Mary's tragedy that she could not trust us, Baker later wrote. Finally, Mary was escorted by Baker and 5 policemen to a hospital where, after a nearly successful escape attempt, she tested positive as a carrier for the bacteria that causes typhoid. This would later be confirmed by more tests. She was quarantined in a small house on the grounds of Riverside Hospital. The facility was located on North Brother Island, a tiny speck of land off the Bronx. Mary herself had no symptoms of typhoid and didn't believe she was spreading it. It's likely she never understood the meaning of being a carrier, particularly since she exhibited no symptoms herself. The only cure, doctors told her, was to remove her gallbladder. I got that correct now, gallbladder, which she refused, and she was dubbed Typhoid Mary by the New York American magazine in 1909, and the name stuck. In a handwritten letter to her lawyer that June, Mary complained, "I have been, in fact, a peep show for everybody. Even the interns have come in to see me and ask about facts already known to the whole wide world." The tuberculosis men would say, "There she is, the kidnapped woman." She wrote, "Dr. Park has had me illustrated in Chicago. I wonder how said Dr. William H. Park would like to be insulted and put in the journal and call him or his wife Typhoid William Park." In 1909, she sued the New York City Department of Health, and the case was brought to the Supreme Court. In the court of public opinion, she would stir debate over individual autonomy and the state's responsibility in a public health crisis. In the court of law, her lawyer argued that she had been imprisoned without due process. The court declined to release her, saying it must protect the community against a reoccurrence of spreading the disease. But Mary was freed early the following year by the city's new health commissioner. He agreed on the condition that she would stop cooking. Without other skills, however, and unconvinced that her condition was a danger, Mary drifted back to her old job around New York and New Jersey. She prepared meals for a hotel, a Broadway restaurant, a spa, a boarding house, and when in 1915 a typhoid outbreak sickened 25 people in Sloan Maternity Hospital, George Soper was again called in to investigate. And the cook was Mrs. Brown, whom he discovered was Mary Milan. Mary had changed her name. She didn't show symptoms of typhoid, but spread the disease while working as a cook. And she was placed in quarantine for more than a quarter of her life. She was sent back to North Brother Island permanently. She spent her days reading and working and helping in a laboratory preparing medical tests, which I'm not sure was safe either. She died there of a stroke in 1938 after a quarter century of quarantine. She never admitted to being a carrier of typhoid, and perhaps without the education to understand it, never believed it. 9 people were all that attended her funeral at St. Luke's in the Bronx. During the course of the 2 outbreaks, at least 51 people caught typhoid through her and 3 died. The number of cases is believed to be much higher. The story of Typhoid Mary indicates how difficult it is to teach infected people to guard against infecting others. But the authorities had already changed the way they responded to some threats, these kinds of threats. At the time of Mary's death, more than 400 healthy carriers of typhoid had been identified in New York City, and none of them had been forced into confinement. The legacy of Typhoid Mary as a super spreader has surfaced in disease outbreaks ever since. Since Typhoid Mary was discovered, the whole problem of carriers in relation to infectious diseases has assumed an immense importance. Soper said in a speech in 1913, "An importance which is recognized in every country where public health work is done and in every army where communicable disease has been brought under control." Well, a post-mortem found evidence of live typhoid bacteria in her gallbladder. Other researchers have cited George Soper, who wrote this. He said there was no autopsy, a conspiracy to calm public opinion after her death. Her body was cremated and she was buried there in the Bronx.